reflecting on like over like since I went to Florida and stuff is like when I came back, I kind of like had like a different perspective. I guess because after a while, when I was down there, I was like, I'm around a lot of pro athletes and like kind of seeing like when you're around those people, like it's not just like there's something you kind of like feel about vibes. There's just something different about a lot of how like they kind of go about business. Regardless, like even kind of when I'm around Nick, it's kind of like a similar situation. Like, and then when I worked for the Nationals, it was like with Mike Rizzo and like some big up guys who were like really high in the game. They all have like this like different kind of perception of things. So like when you're kind of talking to them, it seems like they're like giving you like a more like a direct kind of focus. It's like kind of like hard to explain. So like over the like last 3 weeks, I kind of started like listening to podcasts and like about the what is like actually different about this type of people. So like the Socrates quote is kind of how I want to start it. Is like the secret of change is to focus all your energy not on the fighting the old, but on building the new. So like how I kind of like see that quote is like you're trying to focus like when you're trying to put all the focus on one thing, you can't really go back and try to focus on something that's already happened. Like you kind of have to stay in the present because like at that time frame of like your body, like you're not going to be able to control anything that's happened before and kind of control anything that's happened after. So like the best kind of idea is to like, as corny as it sounds, but like a lot of pro athletes, you listen to like a lot of like post-game press conferences and stuff, they're all talking about how to stay in the present, because when you're the present, that's the only time you can control things. So like, going on to the next one. This is just kind of talking about like how people, like a lot of like average people can't really focus on a lot of things, like how where they struggle and where their undivided attention isn't really undivided, it's more about, it is divided. So it's about in like 6 different places at once. And then some of the facts about that is like trying to focus on more than one thing at a time reduces your productivity by as much as 40%. And that's pretty much about like when you wake up the next day after playing all night, like you're not going to be able to focus on anything. And like kind of like where I kind of get some of the stats is when I was with Salvador Perez, who is one of the best players in the MLB. Like he was in the middle of working on something, and a kid comes up and asks for an autograph, and he wasn't being rude about it, but he was in the same sense because he was like, the kid came up and he kind of like brushed him off, like, and then but I was right next to him, and like this is the first day we met, and he was just like and he's like in the most respect possible. He's like, this is my office. Like I have to focus on what I'm doing, because like when you're a professional, no matter what you are, professional physical therapist, strength coach, you have to set your boundaries. Like you have to focus on what is important to you and kind of keep what's in front of you, because if you kind of get lost in the shuffle of signing autographs at all times, kind of like pleasing other people and kind of having your focus be divided into different places, you're not going to be able to accomplish kind of the goal that you're looking for. So I just kind of like took that as like that was like a big thing from a guy who's been the home run champ, who's been winning the World Series. Like he's been around, so he in the biggest stage possible, playing around 50,000 people a game. He understands what the significance of like a major focus is, and I think it can result it back into a lot of different areas of everyone's life. Like it's not just when you're in here. It's not just kind of when you're around certain people, like giving their undivided attention. People can feel that. Like when you're not like, when you're kind of like half in and half out of the bucket, like you can feel that someone's not kind of focusing on you. And when it kind of reflects back on it, it makes you feel like to the other person that you don't really care, and like that kind of like loses like sight of the goal of any kind of accomplishment. So being distracted by incoming texts, calls, or emails can lower employees' IQ by as much as 10 points. So if you're in the middle of doing something, like when I was just out here and I'm not in my environment where I can kind of focus, I come out here and I start looking at my phone. I don't automatically go back to my computer and go right back to what I was doing, because I have to retrain my thoughts. So that starts taking like my concentration in a lot of different avenues, and it kind of gets me out of that flow state of what the flow state I want to be in. 44% of those distractions, which is kind of good news obviously, is that they are self-inflicted, and another 23% come from text messages, calls, and emails. So you take all of that time, and that's 67% of the time of being distracted. That's extremely productive. Like you're not getting any productivity out of losing 67% of your concentration on a daily basis. So traher is a Latin word and it comes from, the definition of it is a source of an assortment of words pertaining to drawing or to drawing or pulling out. So like when people kind of think about it, obviously it kind of contradict like what I was just saying about focus. Focus actually isn't the opposite word of distraction. Traction is actually the opposite word of that in the Latin word. So traction is pretty much any action that pulls you towards what you're saying you're going to do. The things that pull you towards your values help you become the kind of person you want to become, and that's traction. And then distraction, on the other hand, is the opposite of that. It's just any action that pulls away from what you're intended to do, away from your values, and away from becoming the kind of person you want to be. So they're the difference between like the focus. Like you have traction, you have distraction. Like what is the one you? And at the end of the day, you have. It's not saying that something's more kind of distracting. You have the option of finding the traction. You have the option of finding the traction. At the end, it's up to you. It's not up to anyone else. It's up to you of what you find as your goals and your kind of your values in life. Because when you kind of find those values, you can see where you're kind of going to gravitate towards. And like that kind of goes back to anything, like a lot of professions and a lot of different things is you're gonna. This is perfect. He's gonna. A lot of different things is you're going to be going. Oh, he didn't come in.
Don't walk.
Yeah, he just kept walking. So like, there's obviously when the cream rises to the top, you're going to see the people that kind of gravitated towards the more of the traction thing more than the distraction. So any action is detraction or distraction. So like, this is like a weird thing that I learned down in Florida. A lot of pitchers use this. So like, if you just go like, I'll go around like, what do you see right here?
Sod.
What do you see?
Grass and dirt.
Like, what do you see?
Grass.
Grass and dirt. Grass.
So like a lot of like Chapman, like what a lot of guys use is like when they kind of get out of a rhythm and they're not throwing strikes or something like that, they're not looking at grass. So like they step back and they pick out one piece of blade of grass. So like they'll look at like a tiny piece like that's different than everything else, and it helps them lock back in on things. So see how like it's kind of like when you're pitching, you're looking from a mound to a home plate. Everything's supposed to be tunnel vision. Like you always hear about really, really good pitchers. I have tunnel vision, so it's like they have blinders on and they're seeing one thing only. Whereas like a lot of pitchers and stuff who struggle with command, it's not really mechanical all the time. It's more of a broad thing. So when they're in the middle of their delivery, they can see a guy buying a hot dog in the stands. They can see that stuff because that's what kind of takes them out of distraction. It's the same thing with any sport, like any kind of goal. Like when you start looking at things way more direct, like you can do it in here. Like people, like a lot of pro athletes and stuff say like when they're looking at something, they'll look at the med ball wall and they'll start staring at one thing and it starts getting clearer and clearer and clearer. Like that is the same idea of kind of being focused, like making sure that you have when you're focusing on one thing, even if you look at right now and you look at one piece of grass, it will just, as you keep staring at it, it will keep getting more and more clear. So like it's just more of like it's like a funny, like kind of a funny, weird analogy, like a thing that I've kind of learned down there, and it's crazy when you kind of see it because like either like my pitching coach like Hector, when he's just like he would look at that, like look at like something from a glove, and he's like then look at the lighting inside the glove. He's like you can see the really, really small details. He's like now close your eyes and do everything, and you throw it and I'll go right to the spot. He's like that's what I mean. Like you have a really good measurement of like your focus and kind of how you're going about like all your focus. So I didn't actually read this book, but I listened to a podcast on it, and it's Indistractable, and it's by Nair Yo. So pretty much being indistractable is about understanding the real reasons why we do things against our best interests. So obviously when you're studying or you're trying to do a presentation and you kind of get off track, you're not meaning to get off track. Like no, like you're not, your intention wasn't I need to get off track and start looking at my phone. There's obviously a reason that you're kind of getting off the track, right? So like, we can be indistractable by learning and adopting 4 key strategies. This is what he says. So mastering your internal triggers, making time for attraction, hacking, which is funny the way I said the traction thing, because this isn't from my first couple slides weren't from this book. And then hacking back at external triggers and preventing distractions with packs. So what down here is kind of like you can't really see it well, but it says top is internal triggers, traction, external triggers, and then distraction. And then right here it says control your attention and you choose your life. So I'll go back to this quote in the left-hand corner in a second. So internal triggers is managed distractions that originate from within by thinking differently about the trigger, the task, and our temperament. Furthermore, like reimagining an uncomfortable internal trigger, such as an urge to Google something, we can disarm it. So when you kind of start to look at it, instead of getting like real emotional, why are you, like it's really good to observe things. Like, why am I feeling this way? Like like I meditate a lot, so like I've started to become real good, like not really good at it, but I've gotten way better. For over 2 years of meditating, I'm able to really understand like my emotions sometimes. And obviously sometimes it's harder to control things, right? But the following steps for help are to handle intrusive thoughts. So be conscious of your emotion, of how you're feeling before you get distracted. Like write it down. Like when you start to write things down, it kind of takes the words in your head of thoughts and actually materializes them. So like I started to really journal over like the last like 4 months, and I'm able to kind of see things in a different point of view. So when I'm journaling and I write something down, instead of having all these thoughts in my head, now they're on paper, so I don't have to think about them as much. And I didn't, when I first started doing it, I didn't understand it, but it's crazy how much more like calm your mind gets when you start to write a lot. Because like when you're writing, it's exactly like when I went shark diving. So they said like be super calm in the water, because the reason to be super calm in the water is because sharks communicate with their fins. So when they make certain motions in the ocean, that's how sharks talk to each other. So if you're really splashing all over the place, they swim away, because that's the same concept as when you're in the like you're just yelling a bunch of words, so you can't understand anything, like it's just all over the place. It's hard to communicate. So when it's hard to communicate, it just kind of stresses people out, makes people distracted. You start looking at different things, and you're kind of getting away from your main goal and focus of like what you need to do. So explore the negative sensation with curiosity instead of contempt. Like don't be pissed that you're dealing with something that's like kind of like rubbing you the wrong way. Like emotions are a human nature thing, but if you can kind of take a step back and be like, why am I experiencing that? It kind of helps you see it from a different perspective, and it will help you kind of understand like, okay, like there's a pattern to this. Like everything in life is about finding patterns. Like you start finding patterns, that's when you find X marks the spot. So like being aware of moments in the transitional moments. So like if I'm about to yell at someone, I can just be aware of why you're about to yell at someone. It's not always the root of, it's not always what's happening right then and there. It's the build-up stuff. It's what you're experiencing, and you kind of can't control it. So when you start to be able to control your emotions, that's like when you're like that's like kind of when you're at your peak. And then up here is from like a crazy like Indian like meditator, and he said the ability to observe without evaluating is the highest form of intelligence. So when you're able to observe and not try to make a judgment, that's when you're kind of going to be at your kind of best self. So traction is, how do we figure out where the traction comes from? So before you kind of have to figure out where the traction is coming from, you have to find out your values, right? So before you find out your values, you don't know where the traction is coming from, because there's so many different avenues of where it could possibly be coming from. So like writing down your values is like super important, because you know, you write down, if you got a piece of paper tonight and you wrote down every single thing you want in your life, it ain't gonna fill up 2 pieces of paper. Like you think it will, but it really won't. So like writing down the stuff, you can want a yacht, a boat, or obviously the same thing, like a car, like all that stuff. It's not gonna fill up 2 things. So like what is really important to you in life? And then journaling, like I was saying earlier, like thoughts on the paper out of your head, like you'll be able to see like what is actually important in your life. And then kind of going back to the focus thing, so kind of circling all the way back around, is what time boxing is. So time boxing is blocking off time and committing to it. So if you find out your values and you find out you put everything in order of what is important to you, you're not going to be scrambling, you're not going to be rushing, you're not going to be doing everything, because it's going to be in blocks. So say at 1 o'clock to 1:30, you put your mind to do something. If you have your values in order, you'll do it from 1 o'clock to 1:30, because that's what you set aside for it. There's going to be no other distractions for it. This says, contrary to belief, external figures aren't always harmful. So it says, of each external trigger, ask, is the trigger serving me or am I serving it? And does it lead to traction or distraction? So it's not always going to be something outside, but it always can be from the inside. Like a lot of stuff does materialize from your thoughts. So this is the one quote from Richard Connor. It says, you know very well what the right choice is, yet you keep making the wrong one. And he's saying you have two selves that influence your actions, a conscious one and an automatic one. But this is like a quote. It says, what lies before us and what lies behind us are small matters compared to what lies within us. You ever rewire and change your brain? These like all the, like I just grouped a bunch of podcasts that like wrote talking about these books. So it says like whenever you perform a bad habit, your automatic self is running the show. So when you're doing something, you're not doing the bad habit. Like for example, like my friends smoke a lot, right? So I noticed when they're not smoking a cigarette, they're not smoking weed or something, they're still smoking a vape. So they get really, really in the habit of just literally, like I would never say it to them, but they're pulling up their hand a lot. That's the habit. The habit they need to be kind of smoking something at all times. But they're not doing it, they're not thinking about like, I need to smoke this. They're just so into the habit of actually doing it. That's the habit they've created. And after all, you never choose to do a bad habit consciously. So you just keep draining, when you keep doing something and keep your thoughts go in a certain place, you're just draining that into your actual like your automatic self. And then there's two ways to break habits. And you have strengthen your conscious self so it becomes a dominant force, and it says train your automatic self to just stop slipping up. And this said from Richard O'Connor, he said both work, but in the long run, training your automatic self is a lot less effort because once the neural pathways have been established, they work on autopilot. So if you keep training like really good habits to do things, you're going to end up doing things on autopilot that are in the best interest of yourself and not kind of in the best interest of like a bad habit. And this says the ability to perform deep work is becoming increasingly rare and valuable. Those who cultivate this skill and make it the core of their working life and will thrive. So obviously in today's day and age, there's so many distractions around that it's hard to kind of keep focused, but like it's hard for everyone. If it was easy, everyone would do it. But over time, it does become easy. So you kind of have to make it a discipline in your life to be in a focus and be in a mental state that's kind of in the best interest of yourself, because it's eventually going to help you. And then the people who do that, they thrive because there's so many people out there who are on autopilot, who are at McDonald's on a Tuesday at 10 o'clock in the morning, who are skipping, who are procrastinating their work. Like eventually it's just going to build up and it's just going to create like a lazy kind of thought process. And so you need to be able to quickly master hard things and produce at an elite level in terms of both hard quality and speed. And then the new law of productivity is high quality work produced is equal to time spent and intensity of focus. So if you're putting in the time spent with that intensity of focus that we're talking about, that blade of grass, that's where you get a high quality work produced. So the 4 stages of hyperfocus are pick something that you all want to focus on, eliminate all distractions. So it's all about those internal triggers. This is the source of the vast majority of our distractions: boredom, uncertainty, fatigue, loneliness, anxiety, stress. We seek escape from discomfort. Like that's just the way human nature is. You just always want to go back to what your comfort. So when you start feeling discomfort, you start gravitating back towards that. You got to notice the patterns. Like when you start noticing yourself kind of get into a bad slip up, like if you got to break it right away, because when it starts kind of making it ingrained, it goes back to you're just kind of going on autopilot and you're doing the wrong type of patterns. And then it says focus your attention on that task alone and redirect your mind every time it wanders. So like when I'm like meditating and stuff like that, like some of the best ones that I listened to were ones with bells. So like I'll start to like kind of drift away, but the bell will bring you right back. It's just kind of snapping you out of that autopilot and remaining in the present, which is the most important thing. This is just like a chart I kind of found, so it's pretty self-explanatory. You know, high focus and high energy, there's a purpose to it. Like when you're going back to all the way circling back around to the values, when you have values and you have them written down and you know what you want to do, that's where you're gonna get the most energy, and that's where you're gonna get the most focus. Like when I was around big league baseball players, their focus wasn't just there, their energy was there because they love being there. Like it's what they do every day. So like when they're doing that, they have their purpose. That's it.
You killed that. Yeah. I was reading the book by Jordan Peterson, and like one of the last chapters. It's basically the book's called like 12 Rules of Life from like Chaos to Order. And basically, what it says is that like there's 3 states, and one is like complete chaos, one is complete order, and then somewhere fluctuating in between is always where you're at with like your consciousness. So like complete chaos is everything that's the unknown. It's everything that's horrible. It's everything that like you didn't expect to happen, you couldn't predict to happen, you couldn't work for. And then complete order is like complete comfort in knowing exactly what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and being like in like a content state almost. And then realistically, no one ever reaches like one's complete one side or completely the other. But your consciousness always helps you to kind of move you back to order, because when something happens that is part of like the chaos state, you can ask yourself questions like, just say like, basically, why did that happen to me? So if a patient like kind of leaves disgruntled, which we really don't have, but say they like left disgruntled, you can be like, okay, why did that person leave disgruntled? And like, was it something I did? And you kind of be honest with yourself. And then one thing that Jordan Peterson says that like, since I've read his books, has really like hit home, and it's like, you have to be able to think for yourself, and the only way to actually do truly thinking, people think like they think, or they're open-minded, or they're thinkers, but the only way to truly like think is to basically have 2 people in your head taking complete oppositions to like a certain argument, and then be inside your head and taking those on yourself, those 2 different personalities, so that you can actually have like truly like deep thoughts and like focus about what you want to do, or whatever the task is at hand, which is like a pretty interesting thing. And like that's kind of hit home for me, because I always said like, oh, I like want to think, but like how many times you're like sitting down by yourself and just saying like, for example, like, okay, like I have this patient doing a low trap raise, and then like just thinking to yourself like, okay, why am I having them do a low trap raise? And like even if you had like 2 different thoughts in your head, like that's a horrible exercise, and then that's a great exercise for this person. You think to yourself like, the person that's a horrible exercise might be like, all right, well they're not tolerant to overhead movements, whatever. But if people that think that they're like, it's a great exercise, might be like, okay, I guess low trap X. It's the only way to truly think is to have like 2 opposition thoughts, and that can kind of lead you back in like your deep work and like your consciousness and like being present and like what's actually going on, like they all tie together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, good work.
Yeah. Good. Oh, what's the book? It was like Undistractable, then what was the other one?
Indistractable, and then